Let a few more come in. And greetings and thank you for attending today's discussion. It seems that there isn't a day that goes by without a significant cyber incident, ranging from massive amounts of ransomware to theft from companies to destruction of data, ranging from nation states to very organized criminal groups, to what are called hacktivists, or those that are trying to destroy or steal data in the name of a political cause. So the topic today couldn't be more timely for a discussion as to whether or not we are losing the cyber battle. We have with us today, and we're fortunate to have with us the core group that under current White House and government policy is assembled every time there's a significant cyber incident. So we have representatives with us today, and I'll go from my right to left, but Tanya Ugoretz, a longtime government employee and one of the first senior executive intelligence analysts at the FBI, working on terrorism issues, where she used to brief the then obscure former director Bob Mueller, who now seems to be in the
Perhaps
in
you've
the
heard
news,
of him.
and currently heads the Cyber Threat Integration Center that provides the collective views of the intelligence community. And we have Adam Hickey, a career prosecutor who went from terrorism to cyber cases and worked on significant cases, including being part of our first unit at the time, National Security Division, that was looking to bring a criminal case and ended up indicting 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, and now sits as the top official in the National Security Division, overseeing the protection of our national assets against national security threats. And finally, we are joined by the acting undersecretary and assistant, did we get it right?
Senior official performing the duties of the undersecretary. Terrible name. We'll talk about terrible names later.
Only in government, and we will we'll get into that. But we're privileged to have someone who not just has a wealth of experience in government in that position, but someone who's also spent time wrestling with some of these same challenges in the private sector, and brings both of those perspectives to his current position. And before we get started, I just really wanted to thank Michelle Smith and the Robert H. Smith Foundation for their support of this series of roundtables that allows us to hear and exchange views with the government officials who are currently in charge of protecting us. And with that, let me launch into a hypothetical, because we all know that you can answer hypotheticals when you're a government. So hypothetical, let's say there was a massive ransom worm. So there's a cyber attack that self-propagates and ends up encrypting and locking up the contents of the systems of companies all over the world. Governments, hospitals, private sector companies. And all of those companies are unable to access their own data, which could have life and death consequences in the case of patients. And they receive a note simultaneously all over the world that says, pay us thousands of dollars through Bitcoin, or you can't see your information again. Government hears about this, they get the call. What happens, and what do you do from where each of you sit? We'll start with you, Tanya.
Sure, thank you, John. So first, to preface my answer, I want to give you just a little bit of context about the center that I lead, CTIC, since it is fairly new. We're just finishing our 2nd year of operations. We are the newest and the smallest of 4 multi-agency intelligence centers in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And as part of OD&I, our focus is on foreign threats. So specifically here, foreign cyber threats to U.S. national interests. And our mission is to build understanding of those threats to inform decision makers. We have three primary ways that we execute that mission, and I'll walk you through them in this hypothetical. But those three are building awareness, integrating analysis, and identifying opportunities to respond. So in this case, if we were to get the call, or hopefully, ideally, through our information sources, we would be among the first to recognize the activity that's occurring. Our immediate focus would be on ensuring that the people who need to know that something is occurring know about it, which for us would mean quickly calling out to our colleagues in the other federal cyber centers, as well as subject matter experts in various departments and agencies, particularly those like DHS and FBI, who also have very strong connections to the private sector and private industry, who will likely have a unique window into the activity that the US government doesn't have in the early moments of such an attack. Our role would be to integrate the US government's understanding of what's happening and provide that to the decision makers so that they are as well informed as possible to act on the information. So that means integrating what we know from a network defense, law enforcement, intelligence community, incident response perspective, and bringing that together to convey what we know, what our key intelligence gaps are, what we assess at any moment in time. And that would be an iterative process that we would repeat as we learned more information. And just to share kind of a quick, I will say a hypothetical scenario, when there is not an entity performing that integration function, trying to ensure that we have accurate information that's coming from many different sources to inform decision making. What can happen is that when we try to pull decision makers together to decide on a course of action, out of an hour meeting, you could theoretically spend about 45 minutes of that hour just all trying to get on the same page. What information do you have? What malware does this agency have? Has it been shared with this other group? What we try to do at CTIC is to do a lot of that front-end work so that when the senior decision makers are all coming together to have that conversation, they're all on the same page with a clear and accurate understanding of what we know, at least at a given point in time.
And let me do two follow-ups before we move to the next person. One is, so in this space, what's different than a lot of the other government challenges that you've faced is that so much of the information is going to be in these private companies' hands across the world. So how hard is it, and what do you do in order to get that information from the private sector to make your assessment?
So I think it's one of the most important questions we face. For CTIC itself, when the decision was made to establish this center as an integration point, it was very important that we have a very discrete mission and that we not be duplicating the efforts of our partners. So we very much respect and rely on the very strong relationships that agencies like FBI and DHS have with the private sector, and we don't duplicate those relationships. We work through those agencies to ask questions and obtain the information we need for that integrated picture. And then we also, when we have intelligence information that would be of value to the private sector, we again work through those existing relationships to share that information back. But you're absolutely right, especially in this space where so much of our critical infrastructure is in private hands, but also when we're talking about widespread internet attacks, we know that the US government is not going to have the monopoly on the best information to quickly understand what's happening. We must have strong relationships pre-existing with the private sector in order to be able to obtain that information.
And then the second follow-up is, so another part of that equation is the private sector is out there, they're being hit, nonprofits, hospitals, universities, companies. You're collecting and producing an assessment of what's happened. whose job is it to decide how much of that assessment goes to the private sector so they can use it to protect themselves? And walk us through, what's the process like where that's discussed?
Sure. So as I mentioned, CTIC is an integration center. We are not the original collectors of information. We are not the ones conducting intelligence operations, running human assets, having technical coverage on any targets. We rely on the intelligence that's collected and produced by our partner agencies in the intelligence community and even outside the intelligence community. So they are the owners of the information. It is their decision on how that information can be downgraded and shared, and that's a consideration of the sensitivity of sources and methods, for example. But what role we also play is as an advocate to help bring the community together, to help identify those needs, working with our partners and helping to work with those originating agencies to say, can we bring the classification level, for example, of this critical piece of information down so that we can feed it to our partners to share with the private sector.
All right, last one, then we'll move on. But is this all ad hoc, or is there some formal mechanism that gets the three of you and others together?
So there is a mechanism, Presidential Policy Directive 41, which was published about a year and a half ago, sets 3 lead agencies, coincidentally, as the leads to coordinate the U.S. government's response to a significant cyber incident. And so, speaking just for CTIC, our role in that is intelligence support. We represent the intelligence community when we are coordinating the response to a significant cyber incident. We help support DHS and FBI and DOJ with the intel they need to respond to the incident, and then we take their needs back to the rest of the intel community and serve as a bridge in that way.
Well, Tanya sounds busy. Adam, what are you up to at the Department of Justice and FBI while this is going on?
Well, first of all, John, let me say thank you to you and the Aspen Institute for having us here today to discuss this, and also thank you to all of you for being here with us. So I'm going to bucket the Department of Justice's and FBI's operational roles into 3 categories: investigation, holding the actor responsible, and outreach and education. So when I say investigation, I'm talking about the incident response activities during an event like the one you would describe, where the FBI, through its 56 field offices, and the Department of Justice, through its U.S. Attorney's offices, reaches out to the victim, tries to get information from the victim while being sensitive, obviously, to the fact the victim is dealing with a major incident, and looking for ways not only to take information from the victim so we can figure out more about the incident, but also to give information back, right? So whatever we may learn from other responses, other response activities, that the victim can use to get back on its feet more quickly. Usually that information flows voluntarily. In some instances, victims may, because of other legal requirements, prefer or need for us to use process, and that's where Department of Justice lawyers may be more involved. Then when it comes to holding the actors responsible, I'm including in that obviously trying to build a criminal case or preserve the option to have a criminal case and arrest someone and bring them to justice. But I'm also thinking more broadly about other tools the government has that our investigation may support. So it's entirely possible we may not be able to arrest the person responsible for this malware attack, but they may be associated with a company or store money and dollars in various bank accounts, and our criminal investigation may in fact enable the use of other tools that impose a cost on the actor. And if we're talking about a state-sponsored incident, then we're looking at tools like diplomacy or rallying our allies to take other steps to impose costs on the sponsoring state to deter this kind of activity. And I say outreach and education last, although in an ideal world it would happen first, right? So the activities the Bureau and the Justice Department engage in to educate victims about the dangers of ransomware, what steps they should follow before an incident like this takes place to be ready to respond, what are the do's and don'ts in responding to a ransomware incident, why we might say not necessarily a good idea to pay a ransom. All of that is part of education and outreach. Distributing indicators of compromise or other warnings that you might be already have an intrusion on your system, or what to look for, what to deploy in your intrusion detection system. That's also part of outreach and education, which we work closely with DHS on.
And you talked a little bit in that description about sharing information back to the victims. And let me ask you, same question as to Tanya. Is that a decision made at the Department of Justice? Who makes, if not, who makes that decision, and what goes into the thinking process about what to share and how to share it?
So it's pretty multi-layered, honestly, and it's going to depend on the nature of the information, classification, and some higher level policy decisions. Certainly FBI agents have the ability to share some information back directly to the victim, right? So there may in fact be already, for this incident, there might be a list of indicators the government has already decided to make public to say, hey, you should be looking for these IP addresses or domains. That might go through the FBI on its own, or it might go through a more coordinated process. Then through the UCG or through the PPD 41 process, we may say, hey, look, these particular indicators are classified right now, but we think there's a public value to disseminating them, or we got them from one victim, and we think we need to disseminate them more widely, but in a way that doesn't tip off the public or others to who that victim might be. So there could be more of a collaborative process by which we evaluate what indicators go out. And then at the very highest level, you might, if you're talking about sharing information, there might be an attribution statement of some sort, either something similar to Director Comey's statements following the Sony intrusion, or the DNI's in January following the DNC and other hacks. That kind of information sharing obviously is of a different order.
And one last follow-up. You mentioned UCG and PPD 41. But for those, and I'm sure it's not true of anyone in the audience, but those who might be watching outside the audience, could you explain what a UCG is and what PPD 41 is?
Sure. I think Tanya referred to PPD 41, but she used the long form name, Presidential Policy Directive 41. And it's the governing executive branch policy for how we three agencies and others respond to a significant cyber incident. And one of the ways we respond to that is by standing up something called the UCG, which is an interagency group. I believe it stands for Unified Coordination Group, but I'm so used to using the acronym that I wouldn't swear by that.
You got it right.
Government.
And it's essentially the three leads here, DOJ, and I should be clear that it might be NSD, the component where I work, if we think it's a national security event. It might also be the criminal division if we think it's a sophisticated criminal incident. The intelligence community, and the Department of Homeland Security, plus other agencies as appropriate. So you certainly could imagine if particular parts of the government are targeted, they might be involved in the UCG. If there's a regulated sector, you might have sector-specific agencies, like, for example, energy or HHS, who might be involved in the UCG as well.
And so it's been said, I'm sure in error, that at times there's been turf disputes between different departments and agencies in the United States government. We've talked about a unified group. What's the role of the Department of Homeland Security, and how do you avoid having it be something that turns into a dispute between the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security versus working together?
So the Department of Homeland Security, we do have certain law enforcement investigative authorities under the Secret Service and ICE, Homeland Security Investigations. But my area is the National Protection and Programs Directorate. So if you thought the senior official performing the duties of the Undersecretary was a bad name, National Protection and Programs Directorate is an equally bad name. But effectively what we do is lead the federal civilian government efforts to coordinate cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection activities, particularly across the federal civilian networks, so not DODs, but those non-national security systems, as well as work with the private sector and the critical infrastructure, so your power, water, whatever it is, manufacturing. There's 16 critical infrastructure sectors. So we lead that effort. So when I think about a significant incident, what I'm doing is immediately calling out to the other centers, seeing what sort of information they have, but at the same time, immediately, and I'm kind of saying this figuratively, but also literally, picking up the phone and calling private sector partners. There's a wealth of cybersecurity expertise in the United States, and everyone has a different kind of view or lens on the cybersecurity ecosystem and what's going on and what data is moving both domestically and globally. So what we do is reach out and try to get a handle on what is going on at any given in any given situation. And then I pull that information in, run a little bit of analysis on it, sharing information with some of our partners, both domestically but also internationally. The United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team, or US CERT, is the federal government's essentially network protection response team. Most countries have similar certs. So in an incident, like some of the many ransomware attacks over the last several months, we'll reach out to those certs and say, hey, what are you guys seeing? And a lot of the time we'll get some malware samples back, and we can take a look at what those codes are, what the code looks like, and some of the indicators, and we can load those up into some of the network protection tools we have. And we can also share those indicators out with our private sector colleagues, both the cybersecurity vendors, but also out with many of the large enterprises, large companies, but also small and medium-sized businesses, so they can set their network protection efforts up to trigger on whatever the bad day is. But more broadly than that, we are working things from a left of boom perspective. And what I mean, when you hear Unified Cyber Coordination, Unified Coordination Group, it's actually the Cyber Unified Coordination Group. Unified Coordination Group is a concept that is rooted in traditional physical incident management. So when you think about what FEMA does on a day-to-day basis with incident management, whether it's hurricane response, wildfire response, even earthquakes, things like that, they have a unified coordination group that gets all the stakeholders together, very clear swim lanes. Here is your responsibility, here is yours, here is yours. Department of Homeland Security's is federal civilian network protection efforts and working closely with the private sector. So within that UCG, we are working closely with the other cyber centers, sharing the information that we get out across, and ensuring that we have a good sense so that we do inform the senior leaders of certain response actions that can take place subsequently.
And so you've lived through, and you all have in different capacities, some changes in the way the government is set up to create this structure. I'm curious now in the private sector at Morrison Foerster, I represent corporate clients, and they're sometimes trying to figure out, how do we handle a crisis? Are there lessons we can learn from the way we'd handle a hurricane that are applicable to cyber? Are there things that are different? Having lived through a government restructuring, be curious to get each of your perspectives on things you've learned that the private sector could take back.
Happy to start there. So I did come out of the private sector back in March. I joined the administration, came from a pretty large technology company where I spent the last 3 to 4 years there, a number of years in the consulting and contracting business, again, working with companies and law firms, getting a sense of what their requirements are, and then was in the Bush years. And so I kind of was out in the wilderness for 8 years, come back in, and rather than large changes, I think what we've seen is really a maturation and evolution of the policy and response process. So a lot of the policies that were in place in the end of the 2000s have been built successively up. And when you think about the Presidential Policy Directive 41 that was signed about 1.5 years ago, that is really codifying those relationships. So when I think about what I was always recommending or seeing as effective in the private sector was governance, particularly within an organization, clear governance, who owns the cybersecurity or the information security management responsibility, and are they properly resourced? Are they enabled to make decisions, particularly as you compete against delivery and the product and loss side of the business? Can you ensure that you're actually developing or delivering a secure product? The other side, from an incident response perspective, that's really critically important, and we're learning that, I think, time and time again, it's almost the definition of insanity here, is clear communications, both with your customers and the broader public and stakeholders. I think there have been a number of incidents over the last couple months where ineffective crisis communications didn't serve the company well. So certainly from a Department of Homeland Security perspective now, what I see is our biggest gap it's not a technical capability. It's frankly, it's a strategic communications piece. So need to be able to tell our story better of what we're doing. And just like I mentioned, we're really bad at making names and throwing acronyms on things. I need to have a name that tells my stakeholder set when I knock on the door and say, hey, I'm from DHS and the national, whatever it is, the National Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, whatever my name needs to be, it needs to tell my customers exactly what I do. When I show up and I say I'm with the National Protection Programs Directorate, they think I'm with the IRS or something. It just doesn't work.
Adam?
So I think one of the things the government will tell the private sector, one of the most common things is have a plan in place and know who your stakeholders are likely to be and how you will pull them together. The process we've laid out, the UCG process, is the federal government's high-level attempt to do that. Right? You're going to want the intelligence community, law enforcement, and Homeland Security all to work together and be communicating clearly together in the event of an incident. And you're probably, depending on the sector, may need subject matter expertise from that sector's regulator or others. And so it's a relatively short document, and it pulls together those pieces and says, okay, essentially it sets expectations for communication. It's not that, I mean, I think there are lanes, but let's be honest, when we're both on site at an incident, there may be
It's best athlete.
potential, there may be also potential tensions, right? There may be a tension between, do we get everything out now, or do we need to preserve some information for further collection? The best thing you can do in that circumstance is make sure there's a way to get those decisions, questions identified for decision, funnel them up to the right group of people who already know each other, who already have their phone numbers, to work it through either on standing calls, which we have a lot of during one of these, or on one-offs. And so I think that model of know who your decision makers and your equity holders are likely to be, and that they're going to be accountable for certain types of decisions in the event of an incident is what we've tried to do.
And what do you think about the point that the government's still struggling or has work to do when it comes to strategic communications? Is that an issue that the justice is wrestling with as well? Where do you see it affecting you?
I mean, we probably yes. I mean, I think we are properly used to communicating in certain ways and according to certain rules, and we don't tend to think about how to brand ourselves. In fact, I'm not sure you want a Justice Department that thinks too much about that, to be honest. But we've certainly learned over the last few years that there is a benefit to communicating to our public, to the people we're accountable to, and both so they can protect themselves, but also so they understand generally threats in the bilateral context or the multilateral context we're in.
Yeah, I think the thing I can add to my earlier comment is that given my unique statutory authorities, I'm effectively a public-private partnership organization. You know, I can't compel the private sector to work with me. So if I'm a public-private partnership first sort of place, what that really means is I'm a customer service-oriented business. And so if I'm going to be effective at my job, I've got to be able to tell my story. I've got to have a brand. I've got to have a product set that I can articulate. Here's the benefit of engaging, and here's the value proposition of working with me. And that's a little bit different for DHS than some of the other organizations in the federal government, and that's a little bit what sets us apart.
Though to be fair, I think FBI, certainly, and DOJ have recognized that we are only as good as our branding as well, in the sense that businesses often have a choice. Sometimes they don't have a choice, right? Sometimes the incident is going to become public, and so there's going to be a default to call law enforcement for reasons we can discuss. But where they have a choice, right, do we call the FBI and tell them we saw this weird thing happen on our network, or is it going to be more trouble than it's worth? That, making the case that you should call us, that you might get something back in return, that's something we've tried to get the message out on.
How are we doing on that? It used to be the assessment that the vast majority of cyber incidents, even in the United States, go unreported. Is that still the assessment? Has it changed?
I don't know what I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. I do think, based on the feedback I've gotten, I think the Bureau and DOJ have gotten better at persuading people that we are sensitive to the priorities a victim has in the first few days after an intrusion, that we're not looking to make life worse. At the same time, I think if you're a conservative person, you might say, you know what, it's an unknown and I don't want to go down that road.
And Tanya, you're supposed to know what we don't know. But what is the intelligence community's assessment? Are the majority of cyber incidents being reported or not reported?
Boy, you set such a high expectation there on what I know. No, I think it falls along the same lines as Adam's answer, really. We don't know what we don't know, but that reporting and being able, through our colleagues who are able to go out and visit victims on site and get direct information and understanding of what's happening to a victim, understand the tactics and the techniques that an adversary is using, and bring that type of information back to the rest of us in the community to feed our understanding is really critical.
I mean, one question I get all the time from being on the private side now, and I know it's something we thought about in government, but is, are you kidding me? There's so many different government agencies and acronyms between the federal and the local, let alone the ones that are particularly hard since they don't have cyber in the name. And why isn't there just one phone number, a cyber 911, if everyone's encouraging us to make a call that we can call? And if there is one, what is it? And so maybe I'll just ask each of you, should there be is there a cyber 911? If not, should there be one? And in the absence of one, what's the easiest advice you can give for a company to follow when they're having an emergency?
So I'll start. I don't think the simplicity would be beneficial. So much of what has to happen, or the best support you could get locally, is from local FBI field offices in the first moments of an incident. So, no, it's not 911, but it is a local number probably that you should be familiar with. And there are a couple, I think, clear portals where you can go. The FBI does have an 800 number for this, and DHS, the NCIC also is
U.S. CERT.
Yeah, very easily accessible. So it's also a finite number. Also, your regulator, frankly, may expect to hear from you, depending on the circumstances you're in. So I think it's a manageable number of potential entry points, and the expectation is that we will coordinate with each other, certainly between DHS and DOJ as needed.
Anything to add?
That's part of the strategic communications piece. We just need to do a better, tighter job of telling, it doesn't matter who you call, one of these 2, 3 numbers, whatever, just call somebody.
And what about for the folks here? They leave this lecture today. They go home. They get a screenshot on their computer that says your hard drive's locked. Who do they call as an individual?
I mean, I would call local law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Probably not the intelligence community.
There's the Internet Crimes Complaint Center, which you can get to on the internet, but probably not in that circumstance. And the number I don't have offhand, but you can find it fairly easily.
Yeah, and there are a number of resources and guidance out there on ransomware. I think between the FBI and DHS, call local law enforcement. It's a law enforcement issue.
And every alert that FBI and DHS issue typically jointly has that contact information about who to contact in those instances.
Do you think can local law enforcement do the job though if they get the call? Are they resourced to do the job? Do they have the jurisdiction to do the job since it's often? Where are we right now?
Yeah, when I say local, I'm including the local field offices of the FBI. I didn't mean state and locals exclusively. I think different localities have different levels of sophistication, frankly, and they're offered different services in response. I think cyber is the type of threat that it benefits from attention from a national organization because of the fact that you see information here that you match up with information over there. And so as a victim, I think calling IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, is a good place to start.
And let me get to the subject of our panel today. So we hear every day that there are terrorists attempting to use information to kill people that they've obtained through cyber means, so they want to cause destructive cyber attacks. We hear about nation states regularly both causing destructive attacks, stealing information, crooks day in, day out, stealing massive amounts of information. And the message has been, to some extent, yeah, if you use the internet, there's a chance this happens to you. There's not a product that you can buy that'll keep you completely safe. So are we losing the cyber battle? What's the perspective from those inside fighting this day in, day out?
So that's a provocative question, but it doesn't have a binary yes-no answer. I think you could look at some of the positives, one being, given the prevalence of the internet, given the fact that every single person in this room and most people in the country, except my father, who has still never touched a computer, actually use the internet, we don't necessarily treat it in the way that you're describing. We don't treat it as a high-risk source when we get on it every day. And
Is that a mistake?
it is. I think if we thought about the threats to us from the internet and cyber-enabled types of nefarious things the same way that we did physical threats, we would have a much different posture in our day-to-day life. I'm by no means meaning to say being paranoid, but the positive part of this is that I would say about 2 years ago, we, in terms of the general US public, were not really having this conversation in a substantive, sustained way. I can remember before the 2016 election, in the early days of it, hearing cybersecurity experts bemoan that cyber was not even going to be brought up as a topic in the election at all. Oh, those were the days. So obviously, you know, moving beyond that, we are having the conversation. You are all here. We have the mechanism we described whereby, you know, the US government gets together to address these incidents. So I think there's progress. I think day to day we are, you know, coordinating and addressing issues better. What concerns me beyond that is how we get inured to what we see every day and the growth that we are seeing in terms of the impact of those incidents. You know, I don't know that I can say whether the number of incidents each day is going up or down, but I know that the ones that I pay attention to in terms of foreign cyber threats, their impact is rising. When you look at the number of records stolen in the OPM breach and things like that, just the scale of potential impact, the number of records stolen in the Equifax breach, et cetera, and the fact that it is, you know, to some extent, once that information is gone, it's gone and it's not recoverable. And so I think where we are now in terms of maturing how we approach this threat is how do we look at some of those issues and address how strategically we as a government address those.
Let me sharpen the question as we go to the next to Departments of Justice and Homeland Security. But if I'm hearing you right, you're saying intrinsically what we're doing is risky, that people are starting to recognize that risk when they use internet-connected systems, that's a good thing because it will drive ultimately change. But at the same time, you're worried with the frequency and severity of events, and the current lead official inside the White House on cybersecurity threats, Rob Joyce, put it memorably at our last Aspen Institute event and said he's concerned that it's like a frog being boiled in a pot and that the temperature is slowly rising. So given that concern, where do you think we are and how do you get the frog to jump out of the pot?
I don't think anyone in law enforcement has an illusion that we're going to win in the sense that we're going to eliminate crime of any sort. I think Tanya hit the nail on the head when she said that the increasing understanding among everyone about how computers work, how data flows across the internet, and what you need to do to protect the data you care about, the higher the baseline level of technical understanding, the better. And that's something we can try to do as the government, but we're not the solution there. The other thing the government, I think, has been trying to do over the last few years is adapt to ensure that we are able to bring costs to bear on actors. So we've become more comfortable calling out irresponsible behavior when we see it, particularly when it's sponsored by a nation state. We have made a choice to
just use the word irresponsible could mean getting on the internet without, you know, using the right. Do you mean irresponsible behavior?
Contrary to accepted norms,
okay.
Right? So attacking critical infrastructure in peacetime, disrupting a civilian business, stealing trade secrets for the commercial benefit of your own entities. There is a solid group of like-minded nations that have agreed that those are unacceptable acts. And so then, great, we have the norm. Now the challenge is, how do you enforce the norm? How do you bring consequences to bear? We aren't there yet. I think Tom Bossert has said that is going to be one of the, and it's in the cybersecurity EO from May, it's one of the principal challenges and priorities is to strengthen our deterrence strategy and to come up with ways where violating those norms has real consequence. We are on a path to doing that, right? Having not only charged but also arrested several state actors, having called them out publicly, having used our sanctions, or rather the Treasury Department sanction authority, to bring monetary costs to them. That's the right path. We just need to move down it a little more quickly.
And adding one wrinkle
Sure.
for your review. So hearing where we are now is risky. We're making progress on trying to hold bad guys responsible for what they do. We're having this discussion, but if we're focused just on where we are and as the department in charge of public-private partnerships, what about where we're going in terms of the explosion of new internet-connected devices through the Internet of Things? And if the situation is rough now, is it about to get worse, and are there steps we could take now to prevent that from happening?
So let me play off Adam's deterrence discussion a little bit. So he's focused on the deterrence by cost imposition side of the coin, which is make it really painful for the bad guy to do his day-to-day action. My side of the coin, also working with FBI, is the deterrence by denial. So when you think about the bad guy walking down the street, checking out houses, he sees that security sign, he sees the bars on the windows, he sees a really thick door with a couple locks and the guard dog and all that. That's denial. He's not gonna bother going up and trying to break into that house. And so that's what we're really focused on. It's helping across the community, because cybersecurity, its most core element is a shared responsibility. I can't make people do certain things. They have to do that. I have to be able to help them do it themselves. And whether that's, update your system. So when that once a month Patch Tuesday happens, and you see, restart your computer now. At least that's how it used to be. It kind of happens automatically now, which I'll come to on the IoT question in a second. Do it. Update your computers. Run the latest versions. Don't run a version of an operating system that's 10 years old. It's just not going to be supported. It's not going to have the features that you need. Run as current a version as you can. It's little things like that, changing the physics.
I just ask you because there's been some scary news reporting about Kaspersky in particular, but the idea that if you update your system to protect yourself from viruses, you're actually causing a worse problem. Any advice for folks who are kind of wrestling, boy, I thought I was supposed to update and now I'm hearing updating can be scary?
So putting this into context, look, if you're on a big proprietary operating system, whether it's from Apple or Microsoft or whatever, when they push out updates, they don't do it because it's fun or they're just messing around. There's a lot that goes into that. They're doing it because it's important, and you as the user need to follow the guidance. Now, the way most operating systems, the modern operating systems, are updated now is that happens automatically. So when we think about Internet of Things, there is a kind of a divide in the IT, information technology, so your traditional computers and everything at home, and your operational technology or your Internet of Things. So when you think about Internet Connect, the cliche is your Internet connected toaster or refrigerator, whatever. When you think about embedding technology into a device like that, it's not traditionally, they haven't traditionally been thinking about the security side of it. They've been thinking about the safety side of it. So if I connect something to the internet, is it going to catch on fire? I'm being very general and cliche here, but that's the safety mindset. It's not security, it's safety. So what we need to do is bring those two, the IT community and the OT community, together so that we can marry up security priorities and safety priorities and start moving down the same path. That is in process. It's going to catch up, and there's a kind of a technology harmonization that has to happen. Because again, if I've got the little widget, whether it's the little thing on your device that's tracking your every step or whatever, I'm not thinking about building a secure device. I'm trying to get something as cheaply to market as possible. And so we've got to get everybody along the way that's involved in developing that device, whether it's the software developer, the manufacturer, the deployer, the operator. we have to get everybody kind of pulling the same direction on why security is important. Or maybe the question or the answer to the question is security for that cheap device is not important because it actually doesn't have confidential information on it. It's not something that clicks on and off that can be a safety issue. So we've got to continue building out this dialogue of what are the key critical information requirements? What are the key considerations that we have to work through to go, to increase security? And DHS works with the National Institute of Standards and Technology and a number of international standards and organizations, associations, and a number of different groups. We're working on this problem, but there's a lot of work left ahead of us.
And question for you. So is the chair of the Aspen Institute's new program on cybersecurity and technology, we're putting a group together that's going to make policy recommendations. When it comes to Internet of Things in particular, but we can broaden it out to other areas, what should we recommend tomorrow? If we could make a recommendation tomorrow, what should we be recommending that would really improve either where we are or where we're going? And to sharpen it a little bit on the Internet of Things point, should it be if you come up with a great new standard through NIST process that you described in Homeland, should it be mandatory for a manufacturer to apply it? Should it be mandatory that they have to warn you if they're not applying it? What's your view?
So I can help you out. The Department of Homeland Security released a set of principles on IoT last year. Suggest you go take a look at that. It's a handful of key considerations, particularly from the C-suite, from the executive level of an organization. Here's why security in your IoT devices is important, and that then filters down into the developer ranks. But I'll caution you on the requirement. Is as we've talked about today, internet, for just to start, is truly a global platform. It's a global ecosystem. So if we in the United States were to require manufacturers of products sold in the US to adhere to a certain standard, it doesn't matter if something else in another country doesn't have that same, it's not going to have as much of an impact as we would like if other countries don't have similar requirements. Because since there's internet connection, as soon as a device that's in another country gets infected by malware, then it's still our problem. So we need global solutions to the global problem. And that's where there's a lot of work ahead of us, I think, in the international standard space.
Adam, Tanya?
Yeah, so we've been partnering with DHS on the IoT problem, more from how do we lend support, raise awareness, educate, but starting last summer, right before the Dying DDoS attack, actually.
Could you just explain what that
was? Late last summer, I want to say September, one of the largest DDoS attacks identified at that point, deploying the Mirai botnet, got some coverage in part because it was, I think, notable for a couple of reasons. One was the bandwidth, or the sheer volume of traffic directed during the denial of service attack, and we've been seeing that traffic increase exponentially over time, in part because as there are more devices connected to the internet, it is easier for a botnet master to harness a greater bandwidth. Second thing I found notable about that is the attack was not directed directly towards Netflix or to the sites, right? Or in 2012 and 2013, we saw DDoS attacks by Iranian actors on U.S. banks, right? And the attack was on the website of the bank. This was a more interesting attack because it was at the systems used to route traffic when you type in a website, right, the name of a website.com, to the actual IP address of the computer. The attack was on that joint, I'll call it a joint in the internet. And it not only took down one site, it took down multiple sites for hours. So those are the two, I think, significant takeaways from the Mirai botnet. And now I forgot what I was going to say, except that a couple months before that, the leader of the division at the time, I don't remember his name, but he stood up in Internet of Things task force, said we should get smart on, that was you, by the way, in case you didn't remember and no one else knew about it. We should get smart on what IoT means for public safety and security. And so my advice, you're asking what problem should we solve? So the takeaway I have so far is if a device poses a threat to human safety, I think, I'm not saying we're there yet, but I think there's enough alignment of incentives that manufacturers and regulators are going to want that device to operate securely when it's connected to the internet. I'm not saying it'll be perfect, I'm just saying they have an incentive to do so. But at the moment, very few of us as individuals have an incentive to care about whether our watch or our other device is causing a problem for someone else, an externality. So denial of service is a great example, right? Do I care if my camera or laptop even is sending malicious traffic someplace else, but it still runs the same for me? Do I care about that? If I don't care about that, will I pay more for a device that's more secure? That is an incentives problem, and so if you can think about how to solve that, that would be great.
Tanya?
I think that's a good point. The question I often receive is, why do I care if someone hacks my toaster? What are they going to find out? The setting I prefer on my toast? But I think what we have to understand is whatever is most vulnerable in terms of what's connected, for example, to your home Wi-Fi network, is an entry point. And it's a means by which someone, whether, for example, for criminal purposes, could enter into your network, be able to move from that toaster to another device that's on your same network, say your computer or your iPhone or something else that you connect, and thereby have access to more information that you do care about besides your toast settings. So that's one thing. And then I think Adam hit it right on the head in terms of the other threat aspect. Internet-connected devices, which now number in the billions with a B, are magnifying the impact of the types of attacks that we previously thought were antiquated and low impact, like a distributed denial of service, to the point that they very well could reach a level of magnitude that make it very difficult for industry to respond to and to mitigate. So it's really that harnessed potential of all of those devices used for nefarious means that we're concerned about. I agree. I think there are market forces that will probably help to move the needle. I, for one, just speaking as Tanya, the consumer, would love to be able to walk into Best Buy and look at whether it's a router or a phone or other device, and see some sort of label that would indicate to me that the manufacturer not only produced a quality device that's safe, but at the end of the life cycle is going to update that device, much in the same way my Windows operating system is updated if some sort of security flaw is identified. Right now, for many of these IoT devices, there is no update at the end. It is produced, and from that moment forward, that's it. That's all the security you're going to get.
One last question, because I got to follow up on something you said, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. With just a reminder, so privileged to have this group here today from what's clearly a busy day job, so we are going to have a hard stop at 1:30 to respect their schedules. But before opening it up, you talked about Best Buy, and I do have one. It used to be, it may still be today, that at Best Buy, if you go in as the consumer and you buy a computer and you say, they offer you a package that say, if you want protection from viruses in the future, you can pay an extra 30 or 40 bucks. And that package was Kaspersky at Best Buy. There's been a lot of public reporting now that the government is no longer using Kaspersky systems, but I haven't seen, and I'm getting this question a lot from private sector in addition to friends going to Best Buy, are we supposed to not use Kaspersky too? Is the government going to share any information with us, or should I believe what I'm reading in the paper, not believe in it? Is there any insight you can give on that? Head of strategic
Adam's looking right at me. So a little over a month ago, back in September 13th, I believe, the department issued a binding operational directive, and basically that's an authority we have been provided by the Congress to direct federal agencies, those non-national security agencies, so think not the .mil and some of the intelligence community, but your traditional civilian agencies. We have the ability to direct certain actions and activities. So based on a broad breadth of reporting and investigation, the Department of Homeland Security made a risk-informed information security decision to direct all federal and civilian agencies to identify, and then subsequently remove Kaspersky-branded antivirus products from their networks. Again, this was a risk-informed decision that the department decided that it just was not, it wasn't prudent to further allow Kaspersky products. Now, risk is relative. Risk is going to be relative to everyone. Everybody is going to have a different risk tolerance. But the department decided that the risk tolerance was exceeded, allowing these products to continue on the network. We've shared some of this reporting. In fact, the binding operational directive itself has been released publicly. We've shared it with the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which then has shared it with state and local governments. And that's, from our perspective, this was the federal government, the civilian agencies. Our risk determination it's not acceptable to permit these products on our networks anymore.
I just want to, abstracting from Kaspersky, make a point about trust and the relationship between trust and safety. I don't think, at the individual level, I think unless you are fairly technically sophisticated, you may not know just how much trust you're putting on the internet, right? When you open a web browser and you go to a website, do you understand the relationship between the browser on your computer, its access to the data on your computer, and what that other website you connected to can do, what privilege it has? And if you don't understand that, and you don't understand how to secure your data or control access on your computer, you're going on the internet in a way that you are blindly trusting a very bad neighborhood, potentially. As an enterprise, you need to think about your vendors, right? They may not themselves be malicious actors, but they may be weak points in your network. Not because they intend to be, but because they just don't care about cybersecurity in the same way you might, right? They may not be a data-focused business, but if they have credentials into your network and their network isn't secure, then your network is only as safe as theirs. So this notion of who are you doing business with, who are you connecting to, that's a core part, I think, of understanding the security of your own network and protecting it. And whether it's us as individuals, it's we as individuals, or enterprises, I think we have to grapple with that.
And one follow-up while we move towards bring a microphone towards our first, but if you made a risk-informed decision to issue this directive to civilian agencies, I won't put you too much on the spot on it being on Kaspersky, but is there a mechanism, so the public doesn't know those risks. They don't have access to the same information like we were discussing today, so they can't really make their own risk-informed decision with a product. So who's going to tell them this one's risky, either here's what the risks are, or we advise you don't buy this particular, however you phrase it. Is there a way to do that in government right now? And if not, what could we come up with so that you could send that message to consumers?
So generally speaking, the Department of Homeland Security, through our United States Computer Emergency Response Team, provides a number of technical bulletins, alerts, general guidance and references. So when the Department of Homeland Security makes a pretty bold statement, like issuing the Kaspersky binding operational directive, I think that's a fairly strong signal.
Thanks.
All right, John, we're going to take the first question from the live stream audience, which is, how do the panelists assess the effectiveness of the 2015 U.S.-China agreement on government-sponsored cyber espionage, given that the president is set to visit China at the end of this week?
So I would leave it to the administration to officially assess the compliance. Let me give you a little bit of background on this. So in 2015, the US and China agreed to a set of commitments. And chief among those was an agreement not to conduct cyber espionage activities for commercial gain. So the concern here was activity such as conducting cyber intrusions to steal intellectual property, to steal information that would give Chinese-owned, state-owned enterprises a competitive advantage. It's not the type of activity that the United States conducts, and this agreement, which was the first in a series of bilateral agreements, set that standard that the two countries would not conduct that type of activity for commercial gain. I think a lot of what we've seen in the press and also from some private cybersecurity companies has focused on whether cyber activity is going up or down. That's not really what this agreement is focused on. It's focused on the conduct of cyber-enabled espionage specifically for a purpose, and that is to advantage one company over another. I will say that earlier this month, and Chris could probably speak more to this, both the US and China reaffirmed their commitment to the commitments, so to speak.
So Chris, should we take that as a positive?
Adam was there too.
Okay, sorry, Adam.
Or Chris or Adam?
Where's my invite?
Well, you handled Kaspersky, so I'll take this one. It's fair. I would say we are monitoring for compliance. I'm familiar with the public sector reports that Tanya refers to, and those are heartening to read as far as they go. I would say that we are in a better place where China has made a commitment to abstain from certain behavior because it creates incentives to find occasions where they might not be. And it is, I think, incumbent on all of us to look for those occasions if they exist, and it is critical we hear from the private sector if they do, because we've gone as far as we can go in terms of advancing a norm that I think all of us think should govern the behavior of nations around the world. Our ability to enforce that norm depends obviously on the insight we have into activities on, in some cases, private U.S. networks. So call us if you have a different opinion.
And do you think, China, there's near the question if we start bringing the mic, but do you think, why did China agree to this in 2015? What do you think brought them to the table? Was it just a change of heart, or were there actions? And any advice then going forward for the state-to-state meeting next week?
So any advice I have, I will save for my employer. But the chain of events, I think, to us at the Department of Justice looks a little bit like this. In 2012 and 2013, you started to see a drumbeat of reports for the first time in the private sector calling out China, the nation, as responsible for that kind of theft. In May 2014, the Department of Justice indicts the 5 PLA officers in the case that John refers to. About a year later, President Obama signs EO 13694, I think, April 1st, 2015, essentially allowing the Treasury Department to sanction not only those who steal trade secrets, but foreign entities that might benefit from it. And that could hypothetically include a state-owned enterprise if it got the benefit of a trade secret and then, for example, started competing against a U.S. entity. Then there were suggestions and rumors in the press that the first sanctions under that EO were coming. And then in September 2015 is the meeting between President Xi and Obama, in which the commitment was reached. So I look at those events and I see that by being willing to call out behavior that we believed was criminal and wrong and theft, and by willing to put the authority of sanctions behind it, we got attention and signaled that this was a problem we could not let continue. And now we have a commitment that it won't. So we're better off with a commitment than we are before, where there was, I think, an acceptance, well, this is just how life has to be. Maybe we became the frog in the pot for a little bit. But on that issue, I think we jumped out.
Good. Thanks. Sir?
Hi, I'm Bill Hederman with University of Pennsylvania and an old Bell Labs classified guy. And what I'm concerned about, I thought you might get at on the who's winning or losing question, are free societies at a disadvantage compared to unfree societies? It would seem like it would be easier for some of our adversaries to keep us out than it might be to keep them out. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I mean, I don't want to speak for Chris as a network defender. I think if you're thinking about something like the Great Firewall or SORM, there are certainly some advantages on a technical side that would come from that. But call me an optimist. I think we are better off with a structure that's a little bit more resilient and doesn't depend on being authoritarian.
And also promotes innovation. Security and innovation, changing the physics of the threat landscape and the attack surface, what that really means is our companies, what is our greatest advantage right now is our technological innovation. It's Silicon Valley, it's Seattle, it's Boston, it's Austin. We have truly the world's horsepower in terms of information technology. To the extent we can flip the script, we've heard the term asymmetric threat. What that really means is the barriers to entry. This is not like building a missile. This is cheap. Anyone that has an interconnection anywhere in the world can hop on the internet, go to the dark web, which is a really bad place, don't ever go there. But you can go there and you can buy malware. You can, you think about some of these ransomware, all that stuff's available for sale. So with a little bit of cryptocurrency, you can buy commoditized malware and you can launch an attack. That's what we mean by asymmetric threat. So somebody with $100 can go launch this massive attack. Now we can flip the script a little bit and have asymmetric defense. So when you think about things like operating system updates, like Windows Update, that's an asymmetric defense because it goes out to millions of endpoints like that. When you think about cloud-based email, also asymmetric defense. Somewhere across some cloud-based, particularly in an enterprise setting, has an email that comes in with a malicious file attached or a link that you'd click through to a malicious site. Okay, you click through or you open up that attachment. What happens is there's certain capabilities that you can have a container or a virtual machine that pops up and allows that malicious file to do whatever it wants, but it can't jump out of that virtual machine. So you can get some indicators based on that file. And then what happens, miraculously, is that every other client or every other user on that cloud-based email then has that same protection. Again, asymmetric defense to counter asymmetric offense. So when we ask this question of winning and losing, we're not losing, we're not winning, we're fighting the battle every day, and there are going to be advantages that we can find just in our ability to innovate alone.
Jan Lodel from the Atlantic Council, where Tom came from, Vassar. I think we're losing, and I thought that for a while, because of the fundamental structure of the internet not having any authentication built into it. Authentication in the internet doesn't solve everything, but it would sure go a long way and solve a lot of these things. And there's, I think, plenty of ways to do it. I mean, DNS isn't even quite there, but you've got a lot of other things. So doesn't it make sense for the government to take more of an initiative to try to move to a version of the internet that could be deployed, of course, selectively to begin with, and that would involve authenticating effectively every packet against proper key management structures, and you can choose how tough you want that to be. Without that, do we really have a chance of doing this? Because there's always going to be another path and another approach, and trying to convince all the people that you talked about we have to convince to do the right thing seems to be pretty problematic. And remember, there's a whole lot of kids here who, are just starting and they don't know, and they're going to get on, and once they get on their parents' computers, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that we really need to put a little more effort into the more fundamental problems that have led to this situation.
I think fundamentally, you hit on the fact that the internet was not designed with security in mind. It was developed in just free flow of information in mind, and we've been fighting that battle. I don't spend too much time each day focusing on how can we necessarily break it back down and make it better from the ground up. But I think there's something in there that but at the same time, I would hesitate against creating these kind of walled gardens, which I think is to a certain extent what you're seeing pop up in China and elsewhere.
I mean, I think your comments resonate with me because you were getting at the idea I tried to capture earlier about trust without knowledge. That disparity seems to be a problem, and maybe that would be one of the ways to close it. I don't reach for a government solution, just having seen how we have addressed challenges we have in law enforcement, for example. I'm not sure that's the way to get that done, but I would encourage anyone who has a great idea, the theory is that people will at some point recognize it and be willing to pay for it.
I think we've heard Rob Joyce, the White House cybersecurity coordinator, echo some of what you mentioned, maybe not to the extent of building another internet, but in terms of authentication of identity, the idea that the username and password is not the most secure means of doing that. Looking at things like private-public keys, multi-factor authentication, but also looking at issues like how we use social security numbers, again, for a purpose that really was not intended when those were first issued. And the fact that once compromised, as all of ours probably in this room have been in one breach or another, I think there's some bureaucratic mechanism for getting a new one, but I doubt it's very workable. So I think there is some thought being put into, are there other approaches to how we do that?
This is not one of your lanes here, but I'll put it on you, Chris, as public-private. But so right now, financial institutions are required to use the Social Security number, and at the same time, we're hearing that it's a terrible way to try to do authentication. So, is there a discussion going on within government about having a consistent approach that moves us away from Social Security numbers and passwords and usernames?
So Tanya,
it's none of our specific lanes, but Rob Joyce has said publicly that yes, that discussion has begun in government.
But I think the broader point here is, to whatever extent we can get away from passwords, move into multi-factor authentication, it's just going to increase that network protection ability and move us past just doing the basics right. Again, the reason we're seeing a lot of these attacks is because we're not even doing the basics right. We're using default passwords. We're not updating. We're not running latest versions. We're allowing broad administrator access across enterprise networks. We're just not even doing the basics right. So I think we start doing those, and we'll see improvements, and then we can start working on the bigger challenges.
Mike Vasetic, PBS Online NewsHour. Going back to your original hypothetical attack, I have a self-interested journalistic question. Does the Presidential Decision 41 specify how the public is to be informed when such an attack happens, particularly if it's an attack that shuts down either social media or the cable networks?
Good question.
I don't think it's specific as to how, but I do think one of the values you'll take away from reading it is the need to communicate, whether it's communicate about threat information or communicate more broadly to the public.
Let me just follow one, because the hearings are going on, I think as we speak or today. So slight variation of that question. Whose responsibility is it if social media is not being shut down, but it's being used by a foreign power for its own aims to undermine our democracy?
So this is not the first time we've confronted the use of an incredible platform for malicious purposes, right? We've been wrestling with terrorist use of the internet for some time and the dissemination of propaganda using social media platforms. And over time, I think we have come to an increasing, I think a consensus is forming that is a challenge that we need the private sector's proactive help with. That it's that there is a responsibility in a company which probably doesn't want its platform used for malicious purposes to be aware of the activity on its network and take steps to defeat malicious activity. So if we're talking about a terrorist use of the internet. So I think the government can help, but I don't think we want to live in a world where it's the government's responsibility.
Any further? All right. Sir?
What role does the insurance industry play in all of this, and are they your ally?
So I think it's another tool in the toolkit, particularly for companies, for enterprises, the ability to incentivize practices. So when you think about insurance premiums and policies, hitting certain expected levels of performance from security, to the extent that I can provide information to the insurance industry and develop better actuarial data and a soundness of information that enables them to set better expected behaviors across companies. So definitely an ally.
And I think the market is still maturing. So I don't think anyone would say we are where we need to be, but there's a potential, at least for insurance companies, to have a great positive impact on cyber hygiene.
And it's incredibly complicated to develop these tables. It's not like a hurricane or a flood of the Mississippi River where you can kind of set your watch by it. The way the threat landscape evolves, it's changing a little bit every day, but the more data we get, the more trends we can spot.
Is there a role for government in encouraging a partnership with the insurance sector or having them move faster in this space?
Sure, that's been going on for years. And again, it's information sharing.
Hi, Chris Olson, CEO at the Media Trust. Getting back to public companies or private companies being responsible for the third parties or third-party code that they're exposing me to when I visit their websites. Do you believe that the federal government is responsible as well for the code that they're putting out onto the internet? And in particular, do you think that the federal government is practicing what you're asking Facebook and Google to preach when it comes to the .gov and .mil domains, which are filled with third-party code?
So, trying to unpack that, there's a lot in there. What I would suggest is that from a network protection side for the civilian government, for the .gov, that's where DHS comes in. We're developing a set of tools, developing a set of layered defense approaches that are working back from the endpoint, getting to the data. In terms of the code itself, my view is the more commercial code that we are able to use, because there's a proprietary incentive to keep it updated, to keep it secure, rather than, along with expertise in the private sector, they can develop that, as opposed to government off-the-shelf sort of technology. From a civilian agency perspective, that's where I would move. And we're seeing that a lot in some of the executive orders that have been released by the president, including the IT Modernization Act. It's getting away from legacy systems, getting away from legacy code, move towards shared services where you have that kind of herd mentality or that herd immunity approach.
And I think if you asked senior members of the administration to list their priorities, the first one I hear them mention is strengthening federal systems, the security of federal systems. And the way they describe it, I think that's about two things. One is that our government systems, in some sense, are held in trust for the American people, and so we ought to take care of the security of those systems, but it's also the need to lead by example. So to the extent your question gets at, should the federal government be more accountable for the security of its own information infrastructure, I think the answer from the EO in May is yes, and that's why we're making clearer that agency heads are accountable for that, even though it's an quote-unquote IT or information security issue.
We have time for one more question in the front.
Hi, Tony Spadaro, Spadaro and Associates. Elements of DHS and Justice and the intelligence community all have active liaison relationships with their foreign partners. Now, with respect to John's rather scary hypothetical, given that we've got all IT and telecommunications companies are essentially global, who's going to coordinate the response and recovery aspects of that scenario?
You mean on an international basis?
Yes.
So we are increasingly connected to our operational counterparts abroad. You raise a question that is occurring to us in the federal government, and not every government is structured the same way, and this is obviously easier the more like-minded the nation you're trying to connect with. But even dating back to the DDoS attacks I mentioned in 2012 and 2013, the government started to realize that we have to be much better about sharing information abroad, because the problems and threats we're confronting, they're not all based here. And if we want that server to stop hitting this company here, we're going to need to get help from someone responsible authority there. So there's no formal name I can hand you. There's no governing body, and I think incident response will continue to be something we're responsible for here. But we're going to need assistance through operational channels that we, as you have, and we tend to go through all of the channels, right? We don't say, right, international response is just Justice Department or FBI, even though the FBI has a lot of folks around the world, or DHS or the IC. But instead, we think, okay, who in our government is best positioned in this particular context, in this particular country, to achieve the result we want?
So
Sorry.
no, I was just going to agree with you.
I don't want to stop that.
That type of international coordination is happening from multiple points and at multiple levels. From the intelligence community's perspective, I can say that we work very closely, particularly with our Five Eye partners, sharing intelligence, and also, I think increasingly, working together when we are looking at incidents and attacks that affect not only us or not only our partners, but both of us, to share intelligence and collaborate on the attribution piece of that. Some of the painstaking work that the intelligence community does to determine who was responsible, which really is one of the key first steps to informing response. From my center's point of view, CTIC, we have a team that works with the interagency to develop whole-of-government responses to cyber threats. So this idea, as I think someone else alluded to today, that we're not always going to be responding to cyber activity with cyber activity, that we're looking at the full range of tools in our toolkit. Could be sanctions, could be indictments, could be other means. But not only within the U.S. government, the real power of those whole-of-government options is how you sequence them, how you combine them, and they're made even more powerful if you can do that in concert with an ally and really amplify that effect.
And I've been heartened. There have been circumstances where data has been stolen from a victim and posted publicly or weaponized abroad, and through our relationships with authorities in that country have been able to get it taken down. And so to the extent the victim is concerned about stopping the bleeding, that is one thing we can try to do as through our law enforcement contacts.
Just close with, I mentioned earlier, international partnerships and CERT to CERT, so computer emergency response teams from country to country. But increasingly companies, large enterprises are also having these CERTs or CSERTs, computer security and incident response teams. And they are all coalescing in a number of different international bodies. One of them is called FIRST. And so you have these structures. There are mechanisms and playbooks in place. This is not something we just talk about. They actually have plans in place. And as soon as a bad day hits, they activate their coordination mechanisms, and they can start sharing information, and particularly sharing network protection measures.
Well, I want to hope you'll join me in thanking. We've talked a lot about partnership, but Chris, Adam, and Tanya, I think we couldn't be luckier to have you as our federal government partners, and thank you so much for sharing your time with the Aspen Institute today.